Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to speak to everyone today that's here live on the webinar, as well as any of those of you that are listening to the recording that was posted live afterwards. In order to set the stage for today's conversation, I want to step back in time a ways to Detroit, 1982. Things are moving fast. In this particular year, 4 million vehicles will roll off the production lines in the city. And line workers like this are responsible for seeing 15,000 vehicles a day roll off the production lines. Their focus is on velocity. If they have the wrong brake assembly or the wrong bumper that's supposed to go on the car moving on the production line in front of them, these line workers are putting those parts on the vehicles, and the organization is going to fix these issues after those cars are released from production before they go, hopefully before they go to market. It's behavior like this that eroded the U.S. automakers' share of the domestic market from by 20% between 1965 and between 1962 and 1982. They lost 20% of their domestic market share to the Japanese because Detroit was focused on velocity without controlling the quality of what was going into their products. In 1982, we also saw the entry of thinking from W. Edwards Deming, who produced his well-known book, Out of the Crisis. For those of you that are watching this webinar and looking for new ways to improve innovations in software development, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the teachings that Edwards Deming was bringing to Detroit in 1982 and reflecting on how high speed, high velocity, and high quality manufacturing really works. Deming had spent decades in post-war Japan working with their largest global manufacturers and working with them to best understand how to rely on the best quality products and the best quality suppliers in order to build world-class products that can dominate world-class markets. And a lot of the teachings that he brought to Japan and then was bringing to Detroit in the early 80s focused on things like one of the quotes that I bring from the book: you cannot inspect quality into a product. He was focused on things like that line worker. If the line worker had the wrong brake assembly or didn't have the highest quality bumper or particular part going onto that car, it was actually too late for that person to make any change or any difference in the quality of the products that they were assembling. Those quality decisions had to be made much earlier in the supply chain for these automakers. And it's ideas like this about inspecting, where does quality get inspected, what suppliers do we work with, and building quality in that were emphasized a couple of years later when Goldratt wrote the book The Goal, for any of those of you that have read it, talking about how we streamline and improve the quality of products in large-scale manufacturing processes. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, what does all of this talk about manufacturing and auto manufacturing have to do with software development? Well, as it turns out, software development, as many of you in the development field or working with software development teams may be aware, is that software is actually bringing in a lot of concepts that were used in manufacturing and high velocity, high quality manufacturing. And a lot of the emphasis in DevOps, where we're bringing higher velocity and automated practices to development and operations are leveraging those principles. In 2013, Gene Kim and a couple of others authored a book called The Phoenix Project that is a novel about the DevOps journey and transformation of a given organization. And in that book, Gene Kim introduces the 3 ways of DevOps. The first way of DevOps is, how do you emphasize the performance of an entire system end to end and never pass a known defect downstream? And we're going to talk about this concept today through some research that I've championed over the last couple of years within the State of the Software Supply Chain report. I'm going to share that with you to help enlighten you on the different practices that we have today in software development. If you're a software developer, you're probably aware of these. If you work with software development teams, I'm hoping to increase that awareness of how we actually build software and how we innovate today. I'm going to use some of the data from this research to challenge your thinking about how we actually innovate and how we control quality and security within the software that we're building. Today, when we're in the application economy and people are fighting for their market competitiveness very aggressively, we know innovation is king. Speed for our organizations is critical. And open source is at the center stage of a lot of decisions being made in the industry. So let's get into talking about some of the data that is present and offered in the State of the Software Supply Chain report. So before we do that, for any of you that are unfamiliar with software supply chains, they're actually relatively easy to understand. And in fact, all of your organizations, if you're developing software, have a software supply chain that's in place. A software supply chain acts like any other supply chain in any other manufacturing industry around the world. In the case of software, you have a number of suppliers. These are open source projects or groups of individual or larger groups of developers that are creating code and making that code, those pieces of code, freely available on the internet for other development teams to download. They put these open source projects and the multiple versions of these into large public warehouses called component repositories. If you're developing in Java, you're aware of something called Maven Central. JavaScript developers utilize something called npmjs.org. Python developers have python.org. Anyone using Docker containers uses Docker Hub. These are large internet-based warehouses for components that are used by development and operations teams today. Those development and operations teams are really the manufacturers of the software supply chain. And they're using these components to develop finished goods, or the software applications and services that our organizations rely upon every day. Your organization, as I said, has a software supply chain that is fully in effect today. And I'm going to share some of the data around how prevalent these software supply chains are within your organizations. So let's take a tour down the software supply chain, and I'll tell you a little more about how the supply chains are operating. So to give you a sense of the supply of the components that are available out there to developers, every single day, the supplier base, or the new open source projects coming online, number almost 1,100. So these are new suppliers bringing new code, packaged code to market that any of your development teams can use. If we look at all of the open source projects that